Hi, it's Ted Ritzer with the Greening Government Webinar Speaker Series. And this series is a collaboration between my department, Alberta Environment and Parks, the Alberta Climate Change Office, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. Sorry about that. And this series, the objectives of it, the two goals are to help governments reduce their carbon footprint and to grow their green economies. Earlier today, we had a presentation by Brad Mickley with Red Hat, who introduced a 9-point process for doing open source projects. And what was really interesting was he had mentioned one of the co-founders of Red Hat is actually a Canadian out of Hamilton, Bob Young, who actually owns the Hamilton Ticats. So, which was kind of a nice piece of Canadiana to add to this webinar. Today, we're fortunate to be joined with Todd Wilson of the BC government, who is responsible for the Developers Exchange, but also Todd's got a really interesting take on the use of open source Red Hat technology by the BC Environment Department. So Todd, we can't wait to hear what you have to say about what you guys are up to in BC.
Great, thanks Ted. Great introduction, and thanks everybody for tuning in. So a little bit of background first on who I am. So I work with the BC Developers Exchange here in Victoria, British Columbia. We are a small group of intrepid folk who are looking to change the landscape of how the government approaches technology, how we use technology, and engaging through open source and creating community in order to do our work differently as public servants. So through that exercise, we've done a lot of learning along the way. In some ways, we've shifted gears. So this is our old website, which was the experiment. And this experiment was a way for us to engage with the tech sector and also with other public servants, trying to get an idea, clearly understanding the problem space of why it's hard for government to work with their citizens closely, and then also look at ways that technology could make that easier. So what we are trying to do is encourage tech sector growth. That's very important here in British Columbia. We have a very quickly growing tech sector. We want to transform application development, something that is very hard to do in government in many ways, and we want to make that easier, and we want to make that effective. We want to create new ways to deliver value. And so what we've done is we've partnered with ministries to make sure that we can deliver value through our processes and our technologies in really quick and efficient ways. So I'll through some examples how we've partnered with the Environmental Assessment Office and also the Ministry of Environment's Environmental Reporting Office to really deliver value to the stakeholders of those ministries, both internal to government and also in the environmental community as well. And that brings us to engaging with citizens and stakeholders in different and new. This is really what we have found is by partnering with these different ministries and branches around government, it creates another sort of community model that is a little different than how government typically connects with folks. So our journey is a little bit tech heavy because I am a tech guy, not an environment guy, and I have to sort of, check my tech keenness at the door sometimes, but I do get excited by a lot of this stuff, and I think it's a really interesting way to enable a lot of business value and a lot of the value to citizens. So our journey started with the Open Data Initiative back about now 12 years ago or so. The government in BC started an initiative to open up data sets, and a lot of those data sets were very valuable to environmentalists or concerned citizens who wanted to know things about environmental health, quality, and just sort of the general state of the natural resource sector as well. One of the complaints from the Open Data Initiative was that even though the data was open and available, a lot of it wasn't very accessible. A lot of it was difficult to use in either giant comma delimited files or a little bit cryptic and kind of hard to understand. And that developers weren't able to really leverage this data in any of their applications. It was much more focused at a research kind of target rather than an app use kind of target. So we started our API commercialization project on sort of top of the Open Data Initiative. And what our idea was there is if we engage with developers and make that open data more accessible, that they'll be able to come up with really cool apps. And one of them would have been, a good example that came out of this initiative was APIs that allowed citizens to, on their phone, track bear sightings, so that if somebody sighted a bear, they could quickly input some data into their phone, and that data would come back to the ministry through an API. And that was kind of a proof of concept that we did with, having an API available, having groups write an app, and then having that app engaged with citizens in a new way. What we found through that exercise was that working as government with developers and citizens was quite awkward. We had a lot of barriers in between that are traditionally viewed as some sort of protective layers around government, contracting, privacy, security policies, the data center firewalls. All of these things made collaboration quite difficult. So one of the things that we discovered along the way was that a lot of other jurisdictions were starting to get into open source code development. So once we looked into this, we realized that it made a lot of sense for government to open source their code and make these libraries available for different groups to use and different groups to engage with. And that there was a party going on in GitHub, and so we joined and we set up an organization in GitHub called the BC Gov. And what that allowed us to do was break down a lot of those barriers that were preventing easy collaboration with government. We could have a presence on the internet. We could actively engage with developers and interested parties and stakeholders, and have that engagement be open and transparent and available for anybody to chime in. So along the journey, we developed some principles. And one of the principles that we've adopted and that we're pushing across all of government is an open by default stance. So especially with regards to source code and data, if it can be opened, we should open it by default. We want the discussion to be around what needs to be protected as opposed to what needs to be open. So we're really trying to make a head shift there in the BC government, and it's turning out to really be enabling a lot of interesting conversations and a lot of opportunity for collaboration. So the other principle that we have, as I mentioned earlier, a learn by doing approach. Want to move in these spaces and move fairly quickly and nimbly. And if we always hold back until we understand everything about everything, we're never going to make a first step. So what we do is we have a learn by doing approach where we, take measured risks and take first steps into places where we don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out. And depending on what we find, we either move forward or we pivot around and do something different. The other principle that we lean on is an idea of continuous service improvement. One of the things that we have found was a pattern, and this was a pattern in the open data world, this was a pattern in the API world, and it's a pattern in the application development world in government, was that there was a time box on services or projects that was really tight. They would work on a new initiative for a very set amount of time. A ton of resources would be devoted to it, and then the bell would ring, it would stop, and then it would just sit and collect dust for literally years, maybe decades, and never be touched again until it was atrophied to a point that it was no longer even useful and no one could actually get any value out of it. And then they would go through that cycle all over again and start basically from scratch. What we wanted to do is create an avenue for ministries to have a way to continuously improve their services so that they could always be keeping their tech up to date, engaging with their citizens in a timely way, engaging on issues that are pertinent to them at that moment, rather than holding everything up until it became big enough to be called a project. We wanted things to be cut down into smaller increments and deliver that incremental value continuously. And the other principle that we have is deliver value through collaboration. So this is a recognition that no one person, group, ministry, citizen group, or industry sector has all of the answers, and that by working together, we work smarter. So I think that one's probably the biggest no-brainer for us. So who did we work together with? Well, on this journey that we've taken, a couple of our early adopters were from the environmental world, and this is how sort of Ted and I started our conversation. We initially started working with the Environmental Assessment Office and the Environmental Reporting Branch of the Ministry of Environment. So I'll go through some of their stories to tell you how these principles and our approach and the technology that we've brought to the table has really enabled these business areas of the government to deliver value quickly and continuously improve the value that they're getting. So the Environmental Assessment Office, they are a group that is responsible for all of the environmental assessment processes for any large-scale development. So developments like pipelines, bridges, mines, highways, all of these activities require an environmental assessment by law, and this was the office that handles that process. The problem that they had is their process was defined over a long period of time and had evolved many times over the decades. It was very paper heavy, and there was a lot of handoffs for all of those pieces of paper, a lot of different branches and different office stakeholder groups that would be engaged. And the best technology that they had to really handle a lot of this paper was to scan them as PDFs and put them into a SharePoint folder and just list them all. So it wasn't very accessible, and it wasn't really captured as data. And so it was difficult to know what stage any of these assessments were at, whether they were approved or not, what the public engagement was going like, were there interesting comments, were people for it or against it, is there issues with the assessment? A lot of this stuff was very opaque, and even inside the ministry it was very difficult to get a picture of what was happening with these environmental assessments. This came to a bit of a head with the Mount Polley tailing dam disaster. So when the Mount Polley mine tailing pond dam broke and all of the tailings flowed down into a lake and killed a bunch of trees and created a bunch of environmental damage, there was a lot of call, especially from interest groups and the press, onto, what was their status of environmental assessment? Were they approved? Were they non-compliant? Was this tailing pond a problem before? Did the province know about this problem? A lot of really relevant questions came from people who were concerned about this. The problem that the ministry found was they couldn't effectively answer these questions in a timely way. They had to be combing through all of these PDF documents and scanned documents, and there wasn't one place where they could get the information. And so they ended up not being able to answer these questions in a timely way. And that created friction with these interest groups, and it also eroded trust with these groups. So what the Environmental Assessment Office wanted to do was fix their processes internally so that they could help generate more trust and also just improve their own efficiency internally. So generating trust in the community really was priority number one. They wanted to make sure that our mental assessment process was working in the citizens' best interest. And the way to achieve that was through transparency. So they were really interested in getting their process visible and getting it out there so that people can understand what the Environmental Assessment Office is doing on their behalf. So we partnered with them to create this web application. So this application they call EPIC. This is the Environmental Assessment Office's management app. So the app that's public facing is also the same application that the office uses for their needs. So depending on whether you're logged in or not, there's different features, but this is really the exact same app that the Office of the Environmental Assessment uses. It's the same app that citizens would use to engage with. And that was an important principle along that transparency route, is it's the same data that we're showing. There's a commonality of the data behind this app. There's really no secrets being hidden somewhere. So as you can see, when you click on any of those environmental assessment blue circles there, it brings you into a page that describes what that environmental assessment is about. This one that I use for the example happens to be for the Ajax mine, and their project timeline is now clearly shown here, where you can see, oh, okay, those green ones are the pieces that are done. That blue one is what's in process right now. No decision has been made, and no approval has been given, but we can kind of see where they're at. And if I want to comment on it, you click on those submit a comment button, or if I just want to read what other people are saying, I can do that and click on the read comments and see if the public is chiming in positively for this project or negatively, and what people's concerns are. This was a huge leap forward for the Environmental Assessment Office. This was a game changer for them. They've received rave reviews from their stakeholder groups that they've engaged with to involve them in the process as well. So different citizen action groups and things like that have been involved in the creation of this site. And it's also really invigorated the office itself for their internal processes. So not only do they have more engaged citizen interest groups, they have more engaged staff. The staff like using this application. It's much easier for them to do their job. And they're really transforming their office. On the technology side, what we were able to do is bring this to them as entirely open source. So this application is an open source app. It's sitting on the BC.gov GitHub repository. If anybody wants to download the source code and compile it and run it on one of their servers and leverage it, they can. It's got an open license, that is the Apache 2 license. And what we have seen is there's other jurisdictions that are interested in this application. They'd like to take advantage of this too. So what we're doing as the BC Developers Exchange is by encouraging reuse of these applications in other jurisdictions, and also encouraging a community of developers to gather around these things. We're hoping to kickstart technology sector engagement with the government in a different way. Rather than this be a one-time procurement that the Environmental Assessment Office did on their own, and they bought it, they installed it, and nobody else ever gets to touch it ever again. We've released it back to the community, and this is something that any group can benefit from. The other thing that we did a little different was release this using technology from Red Hat that allowed us to deploy this to the data center in days rather than months. So we're really taking a leading edge approach with this, and it is using cloud technologies as well as on-prem technologies and Docker containers. Don't want to get too technical about how all that works, but not only is it a really good business process and a really good community process, but under the covers is darn cool too. So what are the wins that have come out of this exercise? So we were working with the Environmental Assessment Office for about 8 months to get that app up and running. They had an agile team that they were working with, and what that has done is it's really catalyzed a lot of good projects down the pipeline. So they had a backlog of different projects that they wanted to do, and they were looking at them and thinking that they were going to be very time consuming and very expensive. What we've been able to show is that the natural resource sector can deliver these wins quickly and efficiently, focusing on them with an agile team, using our DevOps practices and all kinds of new technology, leveraging open source and leveraging the open source community, reusing a lot of the technical components. So now they have 5 other projects on the go in this mode. They're all open source, and they're addressing other problems in their sector. Groundwater Wells is managing water quality and registration of groundwater wells. The agriculture application is helping farmers understand how to manage their crops and fertilizers and things like that. So it's kind of a calculator app. The Major Mines Transparency application is a direct sort of grandchild of the EPIC app that I just showed you, where the Environmental Assessment Office was achieving really good results with being more transparent. So the Mines group wanted to achieve those same results. So they took the application and started changing it and modifying it for their uses. And so now they have their own version of it. And so they were able to completely reuse the code and make it better. We've got some mobile app development going with our range use mobile applications. So this is for ranchers who are managing their herds on Crown land. And so this helps them register where their herds are. And the transport fuel reporting system is kind of like a carbon credit app that's being built. And this is for the energy sector in order to be able to managing their carbon credits and trade whatever they need to in order to meet the province's requirements. So this leads us to our next early adopter group that we partnered with, and this is the environmental reporting group. So environmental reporting is really, they're small but mighty. They're a small group in the Ministry of Environment. They produce all of the charts, graphs, and pie charts that you would see in any of the sort of state of environment reports. So air quality, water quality, climate change, anything of interest along those lines. These are the people that compile that data, crunch that data, and then also produce the reports and charts and visualizations of that data. So their problem was an engagement problem. Their reports were well received and people consumed them readily, and they delivered them quarterly, and all sorts of activity goes around that was working just fine. What their problem was occasionally they would be challenged by some of their stakeholders on the community side as to how they compiled their data and how they analyzed their data in order to produce some of these high-level reports. Again, some trust issues between, oh, well, you're skewing the data so that it looks better than it actually is, or vice versa, you're skewing the data so it looks worse than it actually is. Depending on the stakeholder group, they were suffering from a bit of a trust problem, and they needed a way to address that. So we partnered with them in the early days. We started telling them our open source story, and we started telling them the story that we had just experienced with the Environmental Assessment Office, and they thought that collaborating in that way would be really exciting, and open sourcing their reports would be a way to increase collaboration and be much more innovative in how they deliver these environmental reports. So they were early adopters of the Open Data Initiative, so they use their open data sets, they put them in the BC Data Catalog, which is what you're looking at right here, and every month this data gets updated, and it's the same data that they use in their reports. And then what they do is in their GitHub repository, they store the code, they store the pointer to the data that they use, and they also put a description in there on how you can recreate the results so that anybody who's interested in how the results for these reports got created, they can do it themselves. They can recreate the report, they can run the script on the raw data, and then they can get the results themselves. And what they found was this really increased the amount of trust that they got from their stakeholders, especially in the academic communities. The academic communities were able to participate in conversations on GitHub. They would open up issues and come and really participate as a collaborator. And it turned a relationship that was, adversarial is a strong word. It wasn't adversarial, but it turned it into something that was much more collaborative, a much more positive experience for these groups. So here's an example of some of the visualizations that they do. So they use an open source data visualization tool called R Shiny Server. So it takes the data analytic code that's written in the R language and puts it into a visualization tool called Shiny, and it produces charts and graphs like this for them. And these charts and graphs are interactive, and you can explore through them, and it's a really interesting capability for the Environmental Reporting Office. What they found is that people will chime in and ask questions on their GitHub repositories. They can open up issues and ask a question, and then the environmental reporting folks chime in and engage with their community in a really direct and dynamic way. So another thing the Environmental Assessment Office has been able to do is answer one of their challenges. Because they're such a small branch and because a lot of their activities were monthly and incremental, it was very difficult for them to contract to get some of their code written. When they had especially heavy workloads, they would end up having to work long hours, lots of overtime in order to get some of the deadlines met for some of these reports that had to go out. One of their challenges was, in order to procure help, they would have to go through an RFP process that would take typically weeks or months in order to contract developer help to come and work with them. So we partnered with the environmental reporting folks to try out a different method of procurement. We called it Code with Us. And what it is kind of a bounty system where we can advertise work using GitHub issues. So the GitHub issues that you see would reach out to developers who are interested in this and say, we know there's lots of people out there who would love to help, are interested in the environmental reporting, are interested in our code, and are interested in data analytics and data visualization. But these are people who would never respond to a government RFP to work with the government. And we wanted to find a way to work with those folks. We wanted to engage them directly. So we created a procurement method called Code with Us. So Code with Us gets advertised on the BC Dev Exchange site. This leads directly to the code that's sitting in GitHub. So when the work gets done in GitHub. The code gets pulled in, and when the code is received, the developer gets paid for the work that they've done. So we've seen really great engagement with this with the Environmental Reporting Office. They have done 6 or 7 of these Code with Us now. They've had an international community gather around it. They've had developers from as far away as Ecuador show interest in this process. They've enhanced their RShiny server visualizations. They've got happy stakeholders on both sides and to just continue working in this way. And it's really been an enabler for them to improve the quality of their reports, improve the timeliness of their turnaround on the data, be open and transparent with how they're using the data, how they're getting work done, and what reports they're working on. And another thing that's been very interesting with them is they have had community pitch in even without the Code with Us. So people have actually come and noticed that some of their reports could be a little better. Maybe one of their data sets has changed since. And there's an example where one of their community members was trying to recreate one of the reports, and he found that the data set from Statistics Canada had since changed, and therefore the report was broken. And he was interested enough and keen enough that he actually code change and proposed that code change back to the Environmental Reporting Office and said, here, I noticed that your code's broken because Stats Canada changed their data, and here, I fixed it for you, and you can have that. So this is the kind of wins that we are seeing in this space. It's a really interesting way for these divisions in the government, citizens, and work much more closely, openly, and transparently. And it's very exciting to see this going forward. So where is this going? It's a really good question. We have kind of completed our beta stage now. We've been at this for about a year. And now we're moving into rolling this out to people beyond our early adopters. So we're very interested in scaling these processes to be just the way that the BC government does things. So we're taking a look at our principles again. We're going back to them and we're saying, okay, open by default is a key principle here. Open data, open code, and that leads to community building. It leads to best practices, and it leads us to be able to work in a very collaborative and we think much better way than it was in the past. So at that point, I think that's about all I prepared for today. I'm a little bit short, but if there's anybody with questions or there's anybody who's sent questions in, now would be the time to put them out there. So maybe I'll pass it back over to Ted at this point, and we can go forward with a Q&A.
Absolutely, and I'll monitor the questions. But you know, Todd, this is really a new model that governments around the world are taking a really serious look at. I know you're familiar with the UK government's digital transformation strategy, and I know you've watched Liam Maxwell's Open as a disruptor in government YouTube presentations. So, I mean, it literally globally, and it doesn't matter what language, people around the world within government are taking a hard look at the use of open source to better serve their citizens and taxpayers.
Absolutely. I think, you know, the value of working in this way can't really be overstated. You know, there is I don't want to overstate the risks, but I mean, there is some things you need to pay attention to. There's, you know, privacy and security and concerns that do kind of come to mind when people think open source, and definitely those are legitimate concerns. But I think when you take those concerns into account and balance it with the value that you receive on the other side, those concerns are, first of all, pretty easy to manage, and the immense value that you get through working in the open outweighs the risk 100 to 1.
Well, while folks are considering questions, Todd, I would just like to kind of paraphrase Liam Maxwell. What he said in his presentation was essentially, you know, the governments of the UK and Norway both issue driver's licenses, and his point was, well, we have monopolies, so we don't really compete for customers like the private sector. So why not share through open source our approaches to the issuing of driver's licenses? Now, in your case, you've actually said you guys are willing to share your approaches to some of these you know, tasks that government is responsible for, right?
Absolutely. We've got I think about 150 now code repositories in our GitHub organization that are all open and ready for any jurisdiction to share and use. You know, things like school bus registration apps is one example. We have people registering for their health card as another application that, you know, manages the health card registration. You know, and the EPIC application that I pointed out, you know, environmental assessment is not unique to British Columbia. I think pretty much every jurisdiction has a similar process, if not exactly the same process. So again, that's an application that could be easily leveraged, customized a little bit, and reused.
Well, and for example, and I don't know whether you caught Dr. Stephen Liang's presentation on open IoT for smart cities, Todd. But one of the things that we had chatted about subsequent to that presentation was Esri compatible open IoT for coordinated responses to extreme weather. You know, and we had this meeting with some folks from IBM. This is 3 weeks ago, and then, oh my God, what's happening in Texas? You know, like how do you get first responders in the right location in a coordinated way? And the work that Stephen has done over the last decade at the University of Calgary is exactly the kind of open source platform to do just that.
Yep, actually, we're very interested in working in that space as well. We have a project team that we're working with who's exploring IoT solutions for our Ministry of Transportation, which is pretty much those exact same problems. How do you respond to disasters? How do you inform people in a timely way that, you know, highways are closed, or, you know, there's a storm or an avalanche, or in our case, an earthquake? You know, there's lots of things that as government we're responsible for, and there's technology available now to address these things. We just need to be able to leverage them in an effective and timely way. And what we're finding is that going down the open source road really helps leveraging in things in a timely and effective way.
Oh, absolutely. And in that conversation, the other folks that were involved in that were the weather company. IBM, I think, acquired the weather company for something like $2 billion. And those folks were in that conversation as well. Like, because most governments on the planet use Esri, you know, and what Stephen has done is all Esri compatible.
Yep.
So, I mean, it just makes perfect sense to share the code and share this approach to get first responders to save people's lives, literally, whether it's flood or, it doesn't matter what the calamity, to get first responders there in a more efficient way through collaboration. That's what we're all about, right?
Exactly. Yep. And yeah, we're pushing on some other very interesting social issues as well. There's I'm sure you're aware of the fentanyl crisis. That's not unique to BC, but I think is particularly acute here as well. So we have a team that's ramping up right now that is looking at what are the immediate responses that we can potentially do, even just to engage people better, like how to get information out or to understand what people's needs are, because even that basic step of engaging is quite difficult as government. So we're looking for new and innovative ways to do that. We're going to be having a team working directly with us, and that will all be open sourced. We'll be looking to the community for help because nobody's going to know better on how to help such an acute issue than the people who are actually out in the community living with it. So let's not try to sort of stay behind the stone walls of government and pretend we know all the answers. Let's engage openly. Let's come up with some solutions that we can try quickly. And it might not be the perfect answer, but even if it saves one life, well, then it was well worth the effort.
Absolutely, and then it just makes sense. It's like you don't have to reinvent the wheel. This open source wheel is kind of designed to be shared.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Todd, this was fantastic. We haven't got any questions here, but this presentation has been recorded, and it will be stored in our YouTube channel. So probably within 2 or 3 days, it'll be posted to the YouTube channel, and everybody who's kind of listening, you can find them if you just kind of go to YouTube and search for MCCAC. This has been a wonderful presentation, Todd. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for reaching out.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
Bye now.
Take care.